So we have been discussing the hidden and secret teachings of Tantric Buddhism. And last week I mentioned that there are two categories. There's that which is naturally hidden or difficult to perceive, and there is that which is intentionally kept secret. And so, as you may remember, I mentioned that there are those things that are difficult to perceive because they are just too far back in the past or too far into the future. There are those things that are difficult to perceive because they are too far away, for example, in another country or another solar system. And there are those things that are difficult to perceive because of their subtlety. This, for example, is the truth of emptiness or non-duality. So it's not like these are intentionally kept from us, it's just that they're very difficult for us to realize. Now there's another way of classifying knowable phenomena, and that which is naturally hidden from us. And this comes from the teachings on the Abhidharma. There is that which is directly manifest, that which we can perceive directly with our sense perceptions. So, for example, if you have the sight faculty, then you're able to see color and form. And likewise, if you have the smell faculty, then you will be able to smell different aromas. And another important thing to understand is that different beings have different abilities when it comes to our sense faculties. For example, we are all aware that dogs have a very keen sense of smell, much better than human beings. So certain things they will be able to smell and detect that we aren't able to. And then we also talked about those things that are intentionally kept secret. Some things are better left unsaid. And this is a really big problem. It's not insignificant in any way. For example, when I was going into the 4-year retreat on the island of Arran, then I had to hitchhike from the local town called Brodick. And a woman picked me up. She drove down this road going to the retreat center every day because of her work. And so she was aware that there was a retreat center there. And she said to me, she said, "Why on earth do you do it to yourself? I mean, why do you lock yourself up for 3 years?" To her, it seemed like a really strange thing to do, and quite negative, almost like something very extreme and unpleasant. She couldn't imagine for the life of her why anybody in their right mind would do that. But this isn't something extreme in any way. I mean, staying in retreat is something that most people on the spiritual path are aware of. But it's difficult for ordinary worldly people to accept the way we practice. For example, I take my mother out for a walk in the village nearly every day. And when I meet people, I don't talk a lot about Buddhism because they might get the wrong idea or they might react in a negative way. For example, in retreat, then we don't sleep lying down. We sleep sitting up in our box. And usually when I've said this to people who aren't spiritual practitioners, they get quite shocked. They can't imagine why on earth anybody would do such a thing. Spend 4 years in a box, sitting up and never lying down. But again, this isn't something extreme. It's not extreme like some of the practices we hear about. Most people have heard about the Jain tradition, and they see it to be quite an excellent thing. And that's because the Jains practice non-violence. The ascetics will brush the ground in front of them as they walk. They do this so as not to harm any insects that might be crossing their path. But what most people aren't aware of is that the Jains practice extreme austerity. One of the main Jain patriarchs, Mahamudra, in his pursuit of enlightenment, or what they call moksha, he starved himself to death. In fact, both of his parents died in the same way. This is quite common in the Jain tradition. They believe through the practice of fasting that sin is removed from their body. And furthermore, they believe that until they have completely purified their body of sin, they will not be able to achieve liberation. So through the practice of extreme fasting, then often they die in their pursuit of liberation. But if you tell this to ordinary, mundane people, it sounds like this Kenyan starvation cult that recently was in the news all over the world. We don't understand why they do this, and we see it to be something quite negative. Most people these days are aware of the Hindu religious tradition, and they associate it with the practice of yoga. We don't see it to be something extreme or negative. Being peaceful, sitting on your cushion, watching the breath and stretching the body seems to us to be quite a harmless and gentle activity that in no way could be considered extreme. But if you look closely, you will see that many Hindus practice extreme austerity. We've all heard of the Hindu practitioners who walk on hot coals. And whereas this isn't something we would do ourselves, we've kind of got used to the idea. And likewise, there is the vegetarian festival, where people pierce their bodies and faces with swords. I think people have become quite used to this sort of thing, but far fewer are aware of the extreme practices in the Hindu tradition. For example, self-immolation. Many Hindu gurus light themselves on fire. They believe that through this they achieve something called Mahasamadhi. But basically, when it comes down to it, this is just a form of suicide. And it's not the sort of thing that the average, everyday, mundane person will be willing to accept. And for most of us, we can't imagine why anybody would engage in such activity. It seems crazy and very extreme. But this isn't something specific to Asian traditions. Most people will be aware of the Christian monks who flog themselves, and also the American Baptist communities who allow themselves to be bitten by serpents. And let's face it, when we hear about the Amish and Mennonite communities who live as if they were in another time, we can't for the life of us understand why they do it. But 100% it is the case that behind these extreme practices there is some logic or reasoning. In general, it's based on their theology or philosophy. And it's not like we find it difficult to understand or accept the philosophy itself. What we find difficult is to accept the conduct. For example, most people have heard this teaching on the spiritual path that there is no good or bad, that everything is pure, and we don't find it difficult to accept this. But when we hear of the practice of Coprophagy, for example, that's the practice of eating excrement, we can't imagine why on earth anybody would do that. But this is exactly where we get into difficulty. And it's also the reason why these secret or inner teachings are not given to everyone. And that's because most people will get them the wrong way around. So we can accept when somebody says there's no good or bad, everything is pure. We've got no problem with that. Normally what happens when we hear these teachings that there is no good or bad, for us it becomes, as I said before, a permission structure for engaging in negative conduct. We hear the teaching and we think, well, that's great because I want to go out and take some drugs, or I'd like to have sex with my girlfriend. What we don't do is think, great, there is no good or bad, I'm going to eat shit. Do you understand the point I'm making? We only apply it to those things that we are attached to. The whole point of these teachings is to break down our conceptual grasping to the idea of good or bad, so that we have what is called pure vision. But the result of that is that we cling more strongly to those things that we like, for example, sexual intercourse. What we don't cling to are things we don't like, for example, eating shit. And so this practice of eating shit is a powerful way to break down someone's clinging to the notion of good or bad. Of course, there are those people who get sexual pleasure out of eating shit. There's those people who enjoy eating shit. But that's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about is that we frame the teachings in a way that accords with our natural view of the world. And because of this, we merely reinforce our own negativity and never make significant progress on the spiritual path. Now, there's another danger here, and that is, if you teach somebody a very high view before they're ready for it, and they get the wrong idea, then there's always the danger that they will go and teach that view to someone else. So the harm multiplies, it propagates from one person to another. And this is very much the case in the West these days. In America, there's a woman, she teaches Tibetan Buddhism of the Nyingma tradition, and basically it focuses very much around sexual union practice. And so I looked on YouTube to see if I could find one of her teachings. And when I did, I was completely amazed because she had absolutely no idea what she was talking about. She said that the Buddha gave the monastics the vow of celibacy because 2,600 years ago there was no contraception. And this is completely bonkers. It's quite obvious that she has never studied the Vinaya in her entire life. The Vinaya is the scripture that teaches monastic discipline, and in that it is said that a monk or a nun is not allowed to masturbate. And you can see here that this American woman completely misunderstood the teachings, because there's no way you're going to get pregnant by masturbating. Also, it's taught that a monk or a nun is not allowed to have sex with a corpse. So how are you going to have a baby from a corpse? The purpose for teaching monastic celibacy has got nothing to do with whether there's going to be a baby born or not. It's about desire. But I can understand the reason why she taught this position, because she wanted her students to have sex with each other, and in that way, she also wanted to have access to more sexual partners. So as you can see here, when somebody gets the wrong idea on the spiritual path, it can proliferate a lot of negativity. And I think most people will be aware of all the trouble that's happened recently in Tibetan Buddhism. There have been many lawsuits, and people have been accusing their teachers of controlling behavior and sexual abuse. And this is exactly how this kind of thing comes about, by misinterpreting the meaning of the teachings and then teaching that to others. And the real reason why we get into trouble is that we haven't first conquered our negative emotions. And so we may think we're doing something positive, but underlying we're driven by our desire, anger, greed, jealousy, and pride, etc. So it's clear, right? We don't talk a lot about religion and spirituality to totally mundane, worldly people, because they could get the wrong idea, and also they could give rise to a negative impression of our tradition. And anyway, there's no point in telling them. They're not interested, right? They just think you're weird. And then there's those practices that are so extreme that even people within our own religion would be put off by them. For example, eating shit and that sort of thing. And then there's those high levels of practice, for example, sexual union, that if you get it wrong, then that itself can be quite harmful. That's all very clear to us. I think we understand what's going on there. But there's another, much less obvious reason for keeping a teaching secret. And in fact, this is the main reason why we keep a teaching secret. Now, most people have heard about Mahamudra and Dzogchen these days. It's said to be the highest level of meditation. So again, we think, well, why not just teach it to everybody? If it's the best thing, best type of meditation, why don't you just tell people? So I'm going to have to give you an analogy here to understand this. And it's going to be a bit silly. So a student comes up and says, will you teach me the Mahamudra? And I'll go meditate on it. And the teacher says to the student, okay, the Mahamudra is a pink, fluffy elephant flying in the sky. Now, I know that sounds stupid, but the analogy works. Just bear with me. And so the student thinks, oh, great, that's the Mahamudra. I'll go home and I'll meditate. So they sit on the cushion and they imagine this pink, fluffy elephant flying in the sky. They've just visualized something, right? You could visualize anything. You could visualize a candle flame. You could visualize a tantric deity, whatever it is. But it's just something they've fabricated in their mind. It's not actually the Mahamudra. They've just fabricated a visual image in their mind to accommodate what their teachers told them. And it's the same when it comes to things like luminosity. We've all heard that the mind is luminous clarity. And so what we can do is we can just go back to our cushion and then we can imagine a light in our head. But that's not the Mahamudra, that's not the Dzogchen. So you could ask, well, what's the harm in meditating on a big fluffy pink elephant? Or what's the harm in visualizing a bright white light and meditating on that? Well, if you're only interested in shamatha, if you're only interested in calm abiding, that's just making the mind tranquil and gaining some mental acuity, then actually it doesn't matter what object you use. Some objects are more subtle, so they're harder to focus on. Some objects, like a stone or a candle, are more obvious and they're easier to meditate on. But basically, the result is the same. Where it is a danger is when that individual wants to come to realize the true nature of phenomena. So when that individual actually wants to come to realize the Mahamudra or the Dzogchen, then if they fabricate something in their mind and meditate on that, then they will never come to understand it. In fact, this could go on for lifetime after lifetime, because they will cling to a fallacy. They will cling to a mentally contrived object as being the actual true nature, and then focusing on that, they will waste decades and lifetimes getting nowhere. But again, it only really matters for that sort of individual who wants to come to realize the Mahamudra. And so it's seen as being a huge obstacle. And for this reason, then the teacher will not give a pointing out instruction to the nature of mind until the student themselves is ready. And there's various preconditions that student needs, and one of them is unshakable faith. And in general, when we're asked to give rise to unshakable faith, we become very suspicious in the West. We don't like it. And it's a sign that we're not ready to study the Dzogchen or Mahamudra. Somebody who has unshakable faith will be willing to do anything for their teacher. And when we hear that we have to do anything for our teacher, we think we're just getting conned into some kind of trap. And in fact, it often does get used as a trap. It gets used as a method to control people and abuse them. So you have to be very careful. In fact, the relationship goes both ways. The teacher has a responsibility and the student has a responsibility. The teacher has to have compassion. The teacher has to be looking out for the well-being of the student. And someone who is a compassionate teacher doesn't necessarily give the student everything they want. We tend to think if our teacher is compassionate, then they'll tell us the true meaning. A truly compassionate teacher will never teach these things to their student until they're ready. And that's because they can see that it will be harmful to them. From the side of the student, then it's their responsibility to check out their teacher first before relying on them. And then, after thoroughly checking out the teacher, it's the student's responsibility to give rise to faith. And that's not blind faith, that's informed faith. That's faith that arises out of seeing the qualities of the teacher and the teachings. So anyway, this has just been a brief introduction to the hidden and the secret teachings of Tantric Buddhism. But these points apply equally to all spiritual traditions, whether that be Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist. Within all of these teachings, then there are things that are better left unsaid. So I think that's all I'm going to say for this evening. And until next time, then see you later.